Morning students, today's class will be on the functional areas of Sulci and Gyri of cerebral cortex. So the cerebral cortex is the part of the brain which is going to control the entire human body, and the cortex is a powerful part of the brain which is made up of two different matter, grey matter and white matter. Grey matter is nothing but condensation of nucleus, while white matter is the fiber that mainly forms the cerebrum. So the cerebrum is basically made up of majority of white fibers, and gray matter has been condensed to form nucleuses and various centers where some important nervous functions do get condensed. So today's class we will learn about the different sulci and gyri first of all. Then we will also talk about the functional areas of the brain. So today's learning objectives will be external features of the cerebral hemisphere, the sulci and gyri in the supralateral surface of the brain, inferior and the medial surface of brain. We will also look on the surfaces of the sulci and gyri, the poles of the brain, and the functional areas of the cerebral hemisphere. So this is the supralateral surface of the brain. The supralateral surface is the surface which you see from the exterior view, and this is the various poles of the brain. So anteriorly you have a frontal pole which confines itself below the frontal bone. So the anterior end becomes the frontal pole, the posterior end becomes the occipital pole, and the lateral two ends on either side, so on the right and left side you get the two temporal poles. So the brain has a very large area of cerebrum within which you get the deeper to the cerebrum you get the midbrain, and the below that you get the brainstem. So midbrain is a part below the cerebrum, and the brainstem is nothing but the part that contributes to the that's made up of pons medulla oblongata, right? So these are the parts of the brain. So this is the basic, and then we will also have three major surfaces for the brain. The three surfaces include the top, or the view in which you are seeing the brain, is a supralateral surface. Okay, so you know that the cerebrum has two hemispheres, one on the right side, one on the left side. So when a knife is taken and when it is sectioned in the middle, okay, so you will be able to cut the brain into two equal halves. Okay, two equal sections. The surface which faces the inner side, or the faces that which is present between both the hemispheres, is called as the medial surface. And the base is nothing but the surface of the brain that faces the anterior, middle, and the posterior cranial fossa of the cranium. That is the part of the brain that is present facing the anterior, middle, and the posterior cranial fossa within the skull is supposed to be called as the base of the brain. You can also call it the ventral surface. The supralateral surface of the brain can also be given another word called, it can be called as a dorsal surface. Okay, so now let's go into the different surfaces, borders, and poles. So this is the supralateral surface, which is very clearly evident in this image. The supralateral is how you hold the brain in hand. The supralateral surface consists of an important sulci. This sulci is called as the lateral sulcus. The lateral sulcus separates the frontal parietal lobes from the temporal lobe. The lateral sulcus is a deep sulcus, and it is a sulcus that is going to differentiate the frontal, parietal, and the temporal lobes. Then this surface and this view is called as a supralateral view or supralateral surface. Now, as I said, when I take a knife, section it in the middle, this is the medial surface. This is the surface that is facing in the middle, and it is seen in both the hemispheres, right and the left hemisphere. And this surface is supposed to be called as the medial surface. How to clearly identify which is medial surface? The surface of the brain that has a thick whitish tissue which is C-shaped, this area is called as a corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is the tissue that helps in coordination between the right cerebral hemisphere and the left cerebral hemisphere. So, the surface that has that C-shaped structure is called as the medial surface of the cerebrum. Okay, so this is a point of identification for you to know that you're holding the brain facing the medial surface, and this is the surface of the brain that is seen on the inferior side. Inferior side can also be called the anterior surface, and the surface that is facing the inner cranial fossas of the cranium, like the anterior, middle, and the posterior cranial fossa. So the surface of the brain that is facing the cranial fossa is called as the inferior surface of the brain. The structures which very clearly evident in this surface are, you have the optic chiasma, okay, and the optic tracts. The strong long structure that is extended up till the top is the optic. This is the olfactory bulb. The olfactory bulb and olfactory tract is nothing but the tract that is going to carry the smell sensation. So you can very well clearly see the olfactory bulb, the olfactory tract, the optic nerve, the optic chiasma, and you also get the pituitary stalk of the pituitary gland, and this is the interpeduncular fossa area. And on the either sides, you get the lower end of the temporal lobe. See, the temporal lobes are very clearly evident on the inferior surface, and the temporal lobe not only extends here on the lateral aspect, but it is extending downwards. And here, if you see the posterior end, you can see the occipital lobe also, the terminal end of the occipital lobe as well. So this region, if you see on the inferior surface, you will be able to see the parahippocampal gyrus. This is the gyrus which is seen on the either sides of the interpeduncular fossa, and also the contents of the interpeduncular fossa, which we include the mammillary bodies bilaterally, the tuber cinereum, and the presence of the stalk of the pituitary gland. And from here you get the oculomotor nerve taking its origin. You also have the circle of Willis, which is the primary blood supply for the brain located within the interpeduncular fossa. So before we go into all that, let's get thorough with the borders of the cerebrum. So the borders of the cerebrum include the infrolateral border. Infrolateral border, what do I mean by that? Now this is the diagram that depicts the brain with the same surfaces, that is the anterior pole, this is the posterior pole. Anterior pole can be otherwise called as a frontal pole, posterior pole can otherwise called as the occipital pole, and the borders that form it are called as the lateral borders, or you can also call it supralateral borders very specifically. And you can also find another sulcus that separates the frontal lobe from the temporal lobe. This is nothing but the extension of your lateral sulcus. And here you also find the olfactory bulb and the olfactory tract. Okay. Now, to name the borders of the cerebrum, how do we name it first? The border that faces the anterior part of the cerebrum is called the frontal pole, and the border that faces exteriorly or externally, starting from the frontal pole up till the occipital pole, this dotted line is called as the the lateral surface. But the lateral surface, you can divide it as the anterior half can be called as the superciliary border, and the posterior half can be called as the infrolateral border. So superciliary border and the infrolateral border. So the superciliary border is nothing but the border that separates the supralateral surface of the brain from the orbital surface, because this is the surface that is going to separate the frontal lobe from the orbital surface of the brain, which is going to contain the optic nerve and the optic tract and the optic chiasma. So in order to separate the orbital surface from the supralateral surface, you get the superciliary border. The next border is the border that is seen on the inframedial surface, and that is the border which is going to be separating the cerebrum with the cerebral peduncles. Okay, and it is also going to be the border that is going to be extended up till the occipital lobe. And the border which is seen on the medial side of the cerebral hemisphere is called as the medial occipital border if it separates the occipital lobe bilaterally. So if it is separating the tentorial, it is being separated by the tentorium cerebelli. So if you remember a dura mater that separates the content of the posterior cranial fossa from the middle and the anterior cranial fossa, and that is called as the tentorium cerebelli. The tentorium cerebelli is tent shaped, hope you remember, and that tent shaped dura mater will separate the occipital lobe from the remaining parts of the middle and the middle cranial fossa contents and the anterior cranial fossa's contents. So the tentorial cerebelli will pass on the medial aspect of the cerebrum here, and the surface of the cerebrum, which is very closely present along the interpeduncular fossa area, is called as the hippocampal border. Why am I giving the word hippocampal border? Because the gyrus that is seen very close to this peduncular area is called as the parahippocampal gyrus. And since the parahippocampal gyrus is going to be one of the borders for the interpeduncular fossa, we call the border to be hippocampal border. So to be to condense the different borders, first is the infrolateral border. The infrolateral border separates the superolateral surface from the tentorial surface. Next is the superciliary border that separates the supralateral surface of the brain from the orbital surface of the brain. The medial orbital border is a border that separates the medial surface of the brain from the orbital surface of the brain, and the medial occipital border that separates the medial surface of the brain from the tentorial surface of the brain, or the occipital lobe of the brain. So here you also get one more border called as the hippocampal border, which is seen to be the medial border, and it separates the medial surface of the brain from the underlying structures. Okay, they separate the supralateral surface from the medial surface. So it is a border that is separating the supralateral surface of the brain from the medial surface. So totally these are the borders that we will have to know about the cerebrum. Coming to the different sulci and gyri. What is sulci and gyri? The brain is thrown into a number of elevations and depressions. The elevations, or the ridge-like elevation, what you see over the brain, is called as a gyrus, and the depressions are called as a sulcus. Why it should be like that? Why not smooth? The brain needs to accommodate a lot of functional areas within a very small surface area. So in order to increase the surface area, the brain has been thrown into a number of elevations and depressions. So the limited space, it has to accommodate large number of functional areas within the cranium. That is the reason. The surface gyri is around 2000 centimeters square, and it is accounting to two-thirds of the surface of the brain. And two-thirds of the surface of the brain, you are not able to see it visually because it is seen within the structures. That's why on the surface view, only one-third you are able to see. Okay. So why the brain has been thrown into convolutions? It has been thrown into convolutions to increase the surface area, and just because it is having many sulci and gyri, we give it a name called gyrencephalic. Gyrencephalic brain means the brain that has been thrown into large number of sulci and gyri. What is lesioncephalic? Lesioncephalic means a brain with smooth cortex, wherein there is no proper sulci gyri formation, and this cortex itself, if it is smooth, it is called lesioncephalic brain. Gyrus. Gyrus consists of a central core of white matter, and it is covered by a layer of grey matter. So when I take a gyrus, one elevation, if I take elevation of a brain, it is going to contain both the grey matter and the white matter. So it is the central core of the gyrus will be made up of white matter, and it is covered outwardly by a layer of grey matter. So this is the structure of a gyrus. While the sulcus, if you see, the sulcus is a slight groove that is forming a depression between two gyruses. So between two elevations, you always have a depression, isn't it? That depression is called a sulci. And these slight grooves will form deep fissures on the cerebrum. These deep fissures will enhance the size of the brain, and it will help in expanding the surface area of the cerebrum. So mainly there are some important sulci and gyri which we need to remember anatomically, and which is very important from our exam point of view as well as clinically as well. So basic sulci and gyri need to be known with its function. So it also has examination point of view value as well as its clinical value. First, you have a sulci and gyri called central sulci. Central sulcus is nothing but a sulcus that is present in the middle of the cerebrum, dividing it into an anterior half and a posterior half. The central sulcus is usually a deep sulcus that divides the brain into an anterior half and a posterior half. And next, you also have another sulcus called as a lateral sulcus. The lateral sulcus is a sulcus that divides the cerebrum, that is the parietal lobe and the frontal lobe, from the temporal lobe. So the lateral sulcus is a lobe that separates the parietal frontal lobes from temporal lobe. And you also have a sulcus called parieto-occipital sulcus, the sulcus that separates the parietal lobe of the brain from the occipital lobe of the brain. Okay, and the lateral sulcus can also be given another name called as the sulcus of Sylvius, while the central sulcus can also be called as the sulcus of Rolando. Calcarine is a sulcus which is present within the occipital lobe itself, and within the occipital lobe you have a separation in the occipital lobe, so that we call it as calcarinian sulcus. The parieto-occipital sulcus is a sulcus that differentiates the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. Coming to the different lobes of brain. The brain is being divided into different lobes for our study purpose as well as based on its function. The frontal lobe is a lobe that is seen on the anterior end of the cerebrum and it is located within the frontal bone. And the parietal lobe is a lobe which is seen within the parietal bone. It is a large area of the cerebrum. And you also have a posterior ramus of the parietal lobe. The parietal lobe is getting separated from the temporal lobe by means of a sulcus called lateral sulcus. The lateral sulcus is a deep sulcus that differentiates or divides the parietal lobe from the temporal lobe. Then the occipital lobe is a lobe that is located posterior to the parietal lobe and there is a sulcus differentiating the occipital lobe from the parietal lobe. So that sulcus is called as the parieto-occipital sulcus. The parieto-occipital sulcus differentiates the the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe, as well as you do have a sulcus called as a temporo-occipital sulcus which differentiates the occipital lobe from the temporal lobe. So occipital lobe becomes separated and it is a separate functional area with the specific functional areas. So this is the image of the entire sulci and gyri. If you find in the center, what you find will be the central sulcus or the central sulcus of Rolando, immediately anterior to the central sulcus. See how to identify which is anterior, which is posterior. Always the frontal pole comes on the anterior side, the occipital pole comes on the posterior side. And on the lateral ends, you have this lobe which we call it as the temporal lobe. And now the sulcus that is seen in the center is called as the central sulcus, otherwise called as the sulcus of Rolando. Anterior to the central sulcus, you get a gyrus which is called as the precentral gyrus. Why is the word precentral gyrus given? Because it is present in front of the central sulcus. It's been given a term called precentral gyrus. Okay. Then the precentral gyrus again is followed by another depression and that is called as a precentral sulcus. That is called as what again? Precentral sulcus. Okay. Now coming back to the central sulcus here. Behind the central sulcus you get another gyrus called postcentral gyrus and behind the postcentral gyrus there is a depression that is called as a postcentral sulcus again. So whereby on the either sides of the central sulcus you get two very well distinguished gyrus and you also find another gyrus which is seen at the angulation here. See there is a tilting or an angulation here separating the parietal lobe, frontal lobe and the temporal lobe. And this turn is called as the angular gyrus. It's called as what? Angular gyrus. And the margin which is seen above it is called as a supramarginal angular gyrus. It plays a very important role in learning, memory and intellectual part. Okay. Whatever we learn, whatever we are memorizing stays in our mind. We are able to understand whatever we are learning because of the functions of this angular gyrus. Because of this angular gyrus. Next, the lobe that is seen below the frontal and the parietal. This is the parietal lobe. So this is the frontal lobe. Just below the frontal and parietal, what you get will be the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe is usually concerned with memory, thinking, and auditory area. Mainly the auditory area is located in the temporal lobe. The sulcus that separates the temporal lobe from the parietal and the frontal lobe is called as the lateral sulcus. The lateral sulcus is a very deep sulcus and you can also give it another name called as the lateral sulcus or sylvius. Okay. Then immediately below the lateral sulcus, what you get is a gyrus, isn't it? This gyrus is called as the superior temporal gyrus. Now, I divide the temporal lobe into three different gyrus. This image clearly shows you that the temporal lobe has got one gyrus superiorly, one gyrus in the middle, and one gyrus inferiorly. So, the space between the superior gyrus and the middle gyrus, there is a depression. So, again, there is a sulcus there, right? Then, between the middle gyrus and the inferior gyrus, you have a sulcus. So, this is called as a superior temporal sulcus. This is called as a middle temporal sulcus and the inferior temporal sulcus. So, these sulcus divides the lobe into a superior temporal gyrus, middle temporal gyrus and the inferior temporal gyrus. So, till now we have learned completely about the temporal lobe. Now, let's come back to the parietal area. As I said, the central sulcus divides the brain into an anterior half and a posterior half. the anterior half of the brain is fully given to the motor area. So the anterior half is fully going to contain the motor cortex. Okay. So the primary motor cortex, the premotor cortex, the supplementary motor cortex are located in the anterior part of the brain, while the posterior part of the brain, that is behind the central sulcus, what you get will be the primary sensory cortex and the additional sensory cortex. So the post central area is occupied by the sensory cortex, while pre-central area is located by the motor cortex. So I hope I am clear till this. Then the sulcus that divides the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe is called as the parieto-occipital sulcus. The parieto-occipital sulcus is not that very deep and prominent as you see the lateral sulcus, isn't it? So this is the sulcus that separates the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. So this hind part of the brain, which is very small and posterior part, is called as the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe is getting separated from the temporal lobe by the temporo-occipital sulcus. And within the occipital lobe, you also find another sulcus called as the calcarine sulcus. Calcarine sulcus is a sulcus that is present within the occipital lobe, dividing the occipital lobe into two halves. So, what are all the sulci and gyri we have learned till now? I will repeat. The central sulcus, precentral gyrus, precentral sulcus, postcentral gyrus, postcentral sulcus. This is the lateral sulcus that divides the temporal lobe from the parietal and the frontal lobes. This is the superior temporal gyrus, middle temporal gyrus and the inferior temporal gyrus. And this is the presence of the parieto-occipital sulcus that divides your parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. There is also presence of a sulcus within the occipital lobe called as the calcarine sulcus, and the occipital lobe gets itself separated from the temporal lobe by the presence of the occipitotemporal sulcus. And you also have a margin that is seen here, and this is called as the supramarginal gyrus or the angular gyrus that differentiates itself from the parietal lobe, differentiating temporal lobe from the parietal lobe. The main function of this turning or the angular gyrus is learning efficiency, memorizing, cognitive thinking. These are all the features of this region. So let's go into the lobe in detail. First we will talk about the frontal lobe. Frontal lobe has been very clearly colored as pink in color to help you differentiate frontal lobe. The light blue colored region will be the parietal lobe. The dark blue, indigo blue colored stained area is the temporal lobe. The sky blue stained color zone is the occipital lobe. And if you find, I have reflected the temporal lobe and the frontal lobe along the lateral sulcus. Within that, you are able to see one more lobe, that is the fifth lobe called as the insular lobe. The insular lobe is usually located within the frontal, parietal and the temporal lobe. And the insular lobe is so deep because it is believed that during development, the cortical areas, the frontal, parietal and the temporal cortical areas overgrow the insular lobe and it covers it. So, what is insula basically? It is a submerged portion of the cerebral cortex and it is forming the floor of the lateral sulcus. It is being submerged because of the overgrowth of the cortical areas like the frontal, frontoparietal, temporal, opercula. There are two regions, anterior and posterior. Within the insula itself, you can divide it into an anterior half and posterior half by a central sulcus that is located within the insula separately. So there are 3 to 4 short gyri, which we give the word gyri brevia as a name, and there are 1 to 2 long gyri called as a gyri longa. So the insula contains 3 to 4 short gyri called as a gyra brevia and 1 to 2 long gyri called as a gyra longa. The blood vessel that is seen along with the insula is the middle cerebral artery and the deep middle cerebral artery. Coming to the prefrontal sulcus, the prefrontal sulcus is 2 or 3 in parts and run downwards and parallel. They are little anterior to the central sulcus, hence it is given the word precentral gyrus. The precentral gyrus is nothing but the gyrus which is seen exactly in front of the central sulcus, and the superior and the inferior frontal sulci divide the frontal lobe into a superior gyrus, middle gyrus and the inferior frontal gyrus. So the frontal lobe is getting divided into 3 gyruses basically: superior frontal gyrus, middle frontal gyrus and inferior frontal gyrus, which I explained it with the image before. Now, This is the ascending and the ascending rami of the lateral sulcus that divide the inferior frontal gyrus into two parts called as the pars triangularis and pars opercularis. So the inferior frontal gyrus can be further subdivided into two separate parts, what we call it as pars triangularis and pars orbicularis. So they do have separate functions which we will start to learn now. So let's talk about the frontal lobe first. In the frontal lobe, we are able to see that this is the central sulcus that divides the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe, and the grayish colored, the greenish colored area what you see here is the frontal area. The frontal lobe of the brain is involving three gyruses, the superior frontal gyrus, the middle frontal gyrus and the inferior frontal gyrus, and they are being separated by two sulcuses. This is the superior frontal sulcus, middle frontal sulcus and the inferior frontal sulcus. Then the inferior frontal gyrus is getting divided into three parts. The three parts include first part, second part and third part. First part is called as the pars opercularis and it is called as the ascending ramus. It is called as the ascending ramus of the lateral sulcus because the sulcus that is separating the frontal lobe from the temporal lobe is otherwise called as the lateral sulcus. So you can also give it the word called ascending ramus of lateral fissure. Then this is the pars triangularis. Then this is the pars orbitalis. So these are the three parts of the inferior frontal gyrus. So I repeat once again, the frontal lobe is subdivided into three major gyruses: the superior frontal gyrus, middle frontal gyrus and inferior frontal gyrus. The inferior frontal gyrus is further getting divided into the presence of pars opercularis, pars triangularis, pars orbitalis. And this is the precentral gyrus that is very clearly evident like a elevation in front of the central sulcus. So coming to the parietal lobe, till now we were studying about the frontal lobe, now we will talk about the parietal lobe. The parietal lobe is a sulcus that is confining itself behind the postcentral sulcus downwards and forwards. The area between the two sulci is called as the postcentral gyrus. So the gyrus that is seen exactly behind the central sulcus is called postcentral sulcus, and the postcentral sulcus and the region of the parietal lobe is confining itself with the primary sensory cortex. It is confining itself with the primary sensory cortex. So the parietal lobe is divided into superior and inferior parietal lobules by an intraparietal sulcus. So you can divide the parietal lobe into a superior and an inferior parietal lobules by an intraparietal sulcus. The part that surrounds the posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus is called as the supramarginal gyrus. So as I said, the parietal lobe is getting differentiated from the temporal lobe by a turn that is very closely seen to the lateral sulcus, what we call it as the angular gyrus or the supramarginal gyrus. The angular and the supramarginal gyrus is the part of the temporal lobe that differentiates differentiates temporal lobe from the parietal lobe. And if you see, the parietal lobe is mainly getting divided into two halves, that is the superior and the inferior parietal lobules by the intraparietal sulcus. So this is again the image that very clearly tells you this pinkish color the depression that is seen before this pinkish color is the central sulcus, and this stained area is the postcentral sulcus. The greenish stained area is the supramarginal gyrus, and this is the intraparietal sulcus that divides the parietal lobe into a superior half and an inferior half. And this is the sulcus that divides the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. Thereby, you can differentiate the colored parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. So, if you find the red colored line, that is the line which I am talking about, dividing the parietal lobe into a superior lobe and an inferior lobe. Coming to the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe is a very important lobe concerned with auditory cortical areas, thinking, memory, and it is also concerned with intelligence. So the temporal lobe is responsible for the posterior ramus of lateral sulcus, superior and inferior temporal sulci, and it divides the temporal lobe into three halves. So till now we studied that the frontal lobe was divided into three halves. Similarly, temporal lobe is also getting divided into three halves. What are the three halves? The superior gyrus, superior temporal gyrus, middle temporal gyrus and the inferior temporal gyrus. The anterior transverse temporal gyrus, also called as the Heschel's gyrus. So this is to be remembered. The anterior transverse temporal gyrus can be called as Heschel's gyrus, and it is concerned with primary auditory cortex. This can be asked as an MCQ question or an a fill in the blank question, a 1 mark question. So what is the transverse temporal gyrus that is responsible for auditory functions? That is called as the Heschel's gyrus. So this is the temporal lobe colored in a green color, differentiating the frontal, parietal, occipital and the temporal lobe. And this is the extension of the temporal lobe on the medial side. So here you also have the lateral sulcus and the presence of the parieto-occipital sulcus. This is a frontal lobe and this is the parietal lobe. This is the fissure called as a Sylvian fissure that differentiates the lateral sulcus. Sylvian fissure is otherwise called as a lateral sulcus that divides the parietal lobe, frontal lobe from the temporal lobe. Coming to the occipital lobe, the occipital lobe consists of the sulci, transverse occipital sulci, lunate sulcus, the lateral occipital sulcus horizontally, and it's divided into superior and inferior occipital gyri. The lunate sulcus is a C-shaped sulcus with forward convexity just in front of the occipital lobe. The transverse occipital sulcus is an occipital lobe from the supromedial border of the hemisphere behind the parietal occipital sulcus. So the occipital lobe has the three major sulcus: the lateral occipital sulcus, the lunate occipital sulcus, and the transverse occipital sulcus. But this is the lobe, occipital lobe, that is getting differentiated from the parietal and the temporal. The sulcus that divides it is called as the parieto-occipital sulcus, and the sulcus that divides it is called as the calcanean sulcus. So this is the medial surface of the brain, wherein the medial surface is one which has the corpus callosum in the middle. So by the way, you can identify it as a medial surface. And if you find on the medial surface, there are some important gyruses. Till now, we learnt about the sulci and gyri on the supralateral surface, but there are sulci and gyri on the medial and the inferior surface also. So in the medial surface, what are all the sulci and gyri that you can see? The gyrus that is seen above the corpus callosum is called the cingulate gyrus. The gyrus that is seen above the cingulate gyrus is called as this is the sulcus that differentiates the cingulate gyrus and it's called cingulate sulcus. And there is a sulcus seen in front called as the superior frontal gyrus that is getting extended to the medial side. And above the cingulate gyrus, there is one extension that is called marginal sulcus that differentiates the paracentral lobule from the cingulate gyrus. And the sulcus which is seen in above the corpus callosum is called as a callosal sulcus. Okay. Then you also have something called as the cuneus. The cuneus is the one which is seen posteriorly in the occipital lobe, and this is the parieto-occipital sulcus that is getting extended on the medial surface. This is the lingual gyrus, occipital lobe, calcarine sulcus. The calcarine sulcus is very clearly seen on the medial surface. So calcarine sulcus is a sulcus which is seen evidently in the occipital lobe but on the medial side. And you also have the hippocampal gyrus. The hippocampal gyrus is also seen on the medial side. So the sulcus that differentiate the parahippocampal gyrus is called as the hippocampal sulcus that differentiates the medial surface of the brain from the parahippocampal gyrus. This sulcus is called hippocampal sulcus. And you also can see the collateral sulcus, occipitotemporal gyri. And you can also find the interventricular foramen. The interventricular foramen is a foramen that communicates between the lateral and the third ventricle. So the sulci and gyri on the medial surface, what we are seeing is the cingulate gyrus first, which is seen, a cingulate sulcus first, which is seen above the corpus callosum. It is exactly 1 centimeter above corpus callosum. The cingulate gyrus is the gyrus which is seen above the corpus callosum. The cingulate gyrus and the paraterminal and olfactory gyri are seen above the corpus callosum. The callosal sulcus separates the cingulate gyrus from the corpus callosum. The paracentral lobule is a lobule that is the center for micturition and defecation. The paracentral lobule is a lobule, to go back to the image, the paracentral lobule is a lobule which is seen above the cingulate gyrus. This is the place which controls the micturition and defecation of the human brain. So without the control of the paracentral lobule, you cannot urinate or pass stools. So posteriorly, there are two sulcuses called calcarine sulcus and the parieto-occipital sulcus. Calcarine sulcus is present within the occipital lobe. So this is the sulci and gyri seen on the inferior surface. On the inferior surface, what you find first thing is the olfactory bulb, the olfactory tract that carries the olfactory sensation. Then you also have the presence of the olfactory trigone, the uncus, the parahippocampal gyrus, the presence of the anterior perforated substance, the occipitotemporal sulcus, the collateral sulcus, lateral occipitotemporal gyrus, and the medio-occipitotemporal gyrus. These are all the sulci and gyri seen on the inferior surface of the brain. Now, the sulci and gyri on the inferior surface of the brain, olfactory sulcus is lodging the olfactory bulb, orbital sulcus is going to lodge the anterior, posterior and the medial lateral orbital gyri. Posterolateral sulcus is parallel to the calcarine sulcus. Area between the two sulcus is called as the lingual gyrus. The lingual gyrus is continuous with parahippocampal gyrus and that is called as the uncus. So they will always ask you what is uncus. The uncus is nothing but the lingual gyrus that is extending continuous within the parahippocampal gyrus, and it is nothing but the area between the two sulcus is called as the lingual gyrus. What is the two sulcus? The posterior collateral sulcus and calcarine sulcus. Between the posterior collateral sulcus, calcarine sulcus, there is a gyrus and that gyrus is called as a lingual gyrus. The lingual gyrus becomes continuous with the parahippocampal border or the parahippocampal gyrus, and that we can give it the name as uncus. Now let's go into every function of these lobes. We have studied about the different sulci gyri, its location, its presence in the various lobes. Now we will also talk about the functional areas of cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex has been demarcated into large number of functional areas by a scientist called Brodmann, and this was done in 1909. He divided the entire cerebrum into 47 functional areas, and broadly we can classify them as motor areas, sensory areas, association, and you will also have the we can classify the cerebrum into the frontal areas. I'm sorry, the motor areas, the sensory areas, and the association fibers. The motor area is concerned with the activities of all the motor functions. Sensory area is concerned with all the sensory functions which is sent to the brain via thalamus. Then association fibers are the fibers which help in the interconnection between these areas. The motor fibers need to be motor cortex need to be interconnected with the sensory cortex, and these interconnecting fibers are called as the associative fibers. And the associative fibers can be are of actually responsible for the association, interrogation, and cognitive function, and they contribute to 75% of the total surface area of the brain. So this is the 47 functional areas. 47 functional areas of the brain that have been listed as per the Brodmann's classification. They are not in order, but they are they are numbered and based upon the function and their location. They will differ it will not be in order instead. So the purpose of us naming it is easy for identification, and second, every area can be studied in detail. This is the central sulcus. The central sulcus divides the brain into an anterior half and a posterior half. The anterior half consists of area number 4, 6, 8. Area number 4 and 6 will confine itself to the motor cortex area, primary motor cortex. The primary motor cortex area immediately will be followed by another area called as the premotor cortex. The premotor cortex area will be followed by the frontal area, frontal eye field area. Then you have area number 44, 45 area, what we call as Broca's area, responsible for talking, speech. Then you also have an area called area number 312, which is behind the central sulcus, what we call it as the primary sensory cortex. And behind the primary sensory cortex, area number 5 and 7 is the accessory sensory cortex. Okay. Then area number 43, 41, 42 are the areas confining itself to the primary auditory area, and that is located in the temporal lobe. Area number 22, which is called as auditory association area, that helps in associating whatever you hear with the visual and the other sensory activities. So it is one of the associative area. Then area number 17 confining itself to the visual cortical area. Area number 18, 19 association, visual association area are supposed to be named as 18 and 19. Then area number 43 is the gustatory cortex responsible for the taste. And you will also have something called as the somatosensory association cortex, which is responsible for associating all the sensory functions with the other motor functions and helps in the coordination. Coming to the frontal lobe, the primary motor cortex area number 4. So let's talk about area number 4 first. It is otherwise called as primary motor cortex, located in the precentral gyrus. Now you are familiar with what is precentral gyrus and the precentral sulcus. So this precentral sulcus and gyrus will accommodate the primary motor cortex. It is occupied by the primary motor cortex area on the supralateral surface of the brain, and it is also forming the anterior part of the paracentral lobule, because it is this part of the cerebrum that is getting extended on the medial surface. We call it as the paracentral lobule. I hope you remember the paracentral lobule is the part which is responsible for the defecation and maturation functions of the human body. So now let's go into the motor cortical area. It contains large number of pyramidal cells. The motor cortical area is made up of large number of pyramidal cells of birds, and it is mainly the area from where the corticospinal and corticonuclear fibers arise. So to go back to the tracks, there are two types of tracks that you learned. One was the descending track from the cortical area to the spinal cord. So that is descending track, and the track which will ascend from the spinal cord to the cortex is called as the ascending tract. Ascending tracts are otherwise called as sensory tracts. Descending tracts are otherwise called as the motor tracts. So the motor tracts always starts from the brain. So the first, basically the motor tracts can be divided into two types: pyramidal tracts and extrapyramidal tracts. Those which pass through the pyramid of the medulla oblongata is called pyramidal tracts. Those which do not pass through the pyramid of medulla oblongata are called extrapyramidal tracts. The pyramidal tracts include the corticospinal tract and the corticonuclear tract. The corticospinal and corticonuclear are pyramidal tracts that is going to pass through the pyramids of the medulla oblongata, and they are going to take their origin from the primary motor cortical area. Coming to the next step, it's primarily helpful for the electrical stimulation and contraction of the muscles of the opposite side of the body. What is the function of the primary motor cortex? The primary motor cortex is responsible for the contraction of the muscles of the opposite side of the body. So always the right-sided hemisphere brain controls the left half of the body, and left hemisphere of the brain controls the right part of the body. That's why we always say that contralateral hemiplegia occurs whenever there is a lesion with the brain. Always the opposite side hemiplegia or paralysis occurs. So whenever it is a part of the brain that is going to control the voluntary motor activity of the opposite side of the body. Although the cortical control of musculature of the body is mainly contralateral, there is significant bilateral control of the muscles of the upper part of the face, tongue, mandible, pharynx, larynx, and axial musculature. So if the entire body's muscles is controlled by the motor cortex in the brain, and the primary motor cortex will control the muscles of the entire body. How is it controlling? The opposite side. Right hemisphere controlling the left side and left hemisphere controlling the right side. Now there are certain muscles which are having bilateral control. Not only one hemisphere, but bilaterally both the hemispheres contribute to the motor functions. Those muscles are the muscles of the upper part of the face, which is responsible for the facial expression, tongue for the speech, mandible muscles, pharynx, larynx, and the axial musculature. So this is the inverted homunculus. Inverted homunculus is nothing but a diagram here, and this is nothing but the brain depicted in an image, red depicting the motor functions and blue depicting the sensory functions. So here in this image, if you see, the human body can be depicted as different parts here, and from the medial side, first we will talk about the motor side. The motor side, if you see, the feet, the knee, the trunk, and the body shoulders are drawn smaller when compared to the hand, wrist, and thumb. That is because the motor activities of the axial body wall muscles are lesser or not much very specific when compared to the hands. Hand is a very sensitive area, and it is responsible for various contractions, and it has a varied muscular activity. Hence, if you see, the hand is slightly larger when compared to the other parts of the body. If you see the face is drawn large with the lips, jaws, and tongue, pharynx. All of them play a very important role, and they are controlled fully by the motor cortex. So this part of the face, head, and muscles of the pharynx and tongue are not only controlled by one cortex, but it is controlled bilaterally by both the hemispheres, right and the left hemispheric motor cortex, right? Okay. So this homunculus is nothing but a representative diagram to show you that the areas with more functions are drawn bigger when compared to the areas with lesser function. So this is a bluish colored part of the homunculus depicting the sensory part of the brain. So here you find the genital organs, the lower limb, the trunk, the musculature of the trunk, drawn smaller when compared to the hand tips, because the hand tips are fully containing sensory receptors, and they have a lot of sensory functions. And then you also have the face and the gums and the tongue, which is very specific for the sensory functions, and a lot of exclusive sensory functions are there. So they are being drawn a little larger when compared to the body wall, trunk, and the axial musculature of the lower limb, sole, and the genitals. Because they have more functions, they have been depicted little larger in size in the homunculus. See, the homunculus is a representation of the muscles of the body and the organs based upon their functions, motor and the sensory functions. The pharyngeal regions and the tongue is the lowest part, and followed by the face, hand, neck, and the thigh. The leg, feet, perineum are represented on the medial surface of the hemisphere in the paracentral lobule. So the genital region and the leg, the thigh, and the lower limb are confining itself to the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere, which is nothing but the area of the paracentral lobule. Hence, I said the paracentral lobule is mainly responsible for the defecation and micturition, because the entire perineum is under the control of the paracentral lobule. The area of the cortex controlling a particular movement is proportional to the skilled movement, and it's performing the movement, and not based on the muscle bulk participating in the movement. Now, we have not drawn the image based upon the muscle bulk of the organ or based upon the size of the organ. No, we have drawn the homunculus based upon the skill involved in the organ. For example, more sensory skills are involved and more sensory functions are involved, the organ is drawn bigger. Okay, for example, tongue has been drawn bigger. But if you compare the knee and the sole and the lower limb, the genital organs, they are smaller because the amount of skilled sensory and motor function is less, and their entire sensory motor control is less when compared to the muscles of the face and the pharyngeal muscles, laryngeal muscles, tongue and pharynx and etc. That's why in homunculus the size is based upon the skill involved and not the muscle size or the muscle size or what they perform. Okay, or the muscle bulk of the organ. So the face, lips, tongue, larynx, hand are disproportionately larger areas, while the trunk and the lower limb have smaller areas. The lesions of the primary motor cortex in one hemisphere produces flaccid paralysis. Whenever there is a lesion in the primary motor cortex, it will induce paralysis, and that is called flaccid paralysis of the extremities of the upper part of the face. And that we call it as hemiplegia. The masticatory muscles, laryngeal, pharyngeal, and the upper facial extraocular muscles are spared bilaterally. And why they are spared bilaterally? Because both the cortex are taking up the function, and whenever there is a lesion involving both the cortex, they are affected. Only one cortex is affected, then they could be spared. Which one? The masticatory, laryngeal, pharyngeal, upper facial, and the extraocular muscles. So premotor cortex area, area number 6, Brodmann's classification. Premotor cortex is the area that is seen anterior to the motor cortex, and it is a primary motor area in the posterior parts of the middle, superior and inferior frontal gyri, and it extends on the medial surface of the hemisphere. So premotor cortex is the region that is seen in front of the primary motor cortex or anteriorly, and the premotor cortex is mainly seen. See, this is the image that shows this is the precentral gyrus. So this becomes the primary motor cortex area, and this is the precentral gyrus, and this is the primary motor cortical area, and this is the uh, primary this is the primary motor cortical area, and this will become the supplementary motor cortical areas. Okay, so completely, and the frontal lobe, as I said, gets divided into the superior frontal gyrus, the middle frontal gyrus, and the inferior frontal gyrus. So the middle frontal gyrus is getting divided into a caudal part, a caudal front, and a rostral middle frontal. It's getting divided, and the inferior frontal gyrus is getting divided into three parts. That is the pars triangularis, the pars opercularis, and the pars orbitalis. So the premotor cortex, it is lacking a large amount of giant cells of birds, and it is main site for the cortical origin. But here it is going to be the site of origin for all the extrapyramidal tracts. The primary motor cortex was the site of origin for the corticospinal and corticonuclear tracts, which are otherwise called as the pyramidal tracts. The extrapyramidal tracts are the tracts which is responsible for the origin of the extrapyramidal tracts like the cortico-rubral, cortico-olivary and the cortico-nigral fibers take their origin from the premotor area. Successful performance of the voluntary motor activities, primary motor cortex area receives numerous inputs from sensory cortex, thalamus and the basal ganglia. So from the primary motor area, they receives numerous inputs from the sensory cortex. From the sensory cortex, the fibers are actually the sensory fibers are coming down from the peripheral reception centers to the spinal cord. From the spinal cord, it is ascending up till the thalamus. In the thalamus, it is undergoing a relay in the ventroposterolateral and ventroposteromedial nucleus of thalamus. Then from there, it is reaching the sensory cortex of the cerebrum. So, what are the premotor functions? The premotor functions are it restores programs of the motor activity assembled as a result of past experiences. The premotor is responsible for programming the intended movements of the primary motor area and controlling the movements in progress. So, what is the purpose of premotor area? The premotor area is responsible for programming of movements. So, when you encounter any, for example, you are going to touch a object which is very hot. Okay, you have touched the object which is hot, and once the hand receives the heat, the reception has been sent to the spinal cord. Through the spinal cord, it has been taken through the thalamus as a sensory tract. It reaches the primary sensory cortex in the brain, and once it has reached you, the heat, the brain is told that it is hot, and immediately you are supposed to remove your hot hand from the hot object. Now, the primary sensory cortex is associating itself with the motor cortex. It is telling the motor cortex that it is hot and the hand needs to be removed. Then, because of the associated interaction, the primary motor cortex now directs it is directing through the motor descending fibers, through the corticospinal or the nuclear fibers, it is taken to the hands, okay, through the muscles of the hand, and the hand is removed immediately from the hot object. So here there is sensory activity that takes the temperature. The sensory cortex receives it and immediately it is sending responses to the motor cortex, and the motor cortex directs the musculature of the hand to be removed immediately so that the further heat is prevented. So here there is programming of the intended movements and it is fully under the control of the primary motor area. Okay. So whenever there is a lesion of the premotor area, there is a difficulty in performing skilled movements. Skilled movements include drawing diagrams, skillful activities, carving, painting, sculpturing. These are skillful handwriting, beautiful handwriting is all skillful activity. So completely coming to the next one, the supplementary motor area. The supplementary motor area is located in the medial frontal gyrus on the medial surface of the hemisphere, anterior to the paracentral lobule. The stimulation of the supplementary motor area produces complex movements, and some of them are described as assumptions of posture, which bilateral effects including turning of the head, assuming positions of the trunk and lower limb. So the primary motor cortex helps you to assume the position of your limbs, assumes the position of your body and your posture, so that it is helping you to assume your posture. So when you are erectly sitting and listening to the class, you know that the body is erect, the limbs are erect. You don't have to see the limb whether it is in the position. You already know or assume that it is in the right position. That is actually told by the supplementary motor area. Thereby, the body is in complete control and you are maintaining it in the right posture and equilibrium. So coming to the lesions of the regions of supplementary motor cortical area, produces bilateral flexor hypotonia with no paresis or paralysis. So whenever there is a lesion, you can get a bilateral flexor hypotonia, but usually there is no paralysis as it is, but there can be loss of sensation. So that is called as paresis. Coming to the frontal eye field area, area number 8. The area number 8 is electrical stimulation of the region of the deviation of eyes. The purpose of the frontal eye field is to control the movements of the eyeball. You know that the eyeball is controlled by the muscles, and those muscles are called as the extraocular and intraocular muscles. The extraocular muscles are responsible for the movement of the eyeballs to the medial side, lateral side, superior, inferior. So the movement of the eyeball is under the control of the motor cortex again, because it is the muscles, right? So it has to be under the control of the motor. So this area which is controlling exclusively the extraocular muscles are called as the frontal eye field. The frontal eye field is for the voluntary scanning movements of the eyeball, and it is independent of visual stimuli. It has got nothing to do with visual stimuli. So visual stimuli is always concerned with sensory part. Vision is sensory and it is taken to sensory cortex. Now we are only talking about the movement of the eyeball. The movement of the eyeball is also necessary for proper vision, isn't it? So the motor activity which is concerning with the movements of the eyeball is called as it is controlled by the frontal eye field area number 8. The frontal eye field is connected with visual cortex by the association fibers, and the lesion of one hemisphere causes two eyes to deviate to the sides of the lesion, and inability to return or turn eyes to the opposite side is called as the lesions of the supplementary motor cortex. So this is the area which is colored yellow in color is the primary motor area, premotor area which we learned just now. The blue one is a frontal eye field area. The green area is called as the Broca's area or the area of language or what we speak. Then the area stained in pink color is the postcentral gyrus, otherwise called as the primary sensory cortical area, and this area is nothing but area number 42, 43. Again it is for language coordination and also it has the auditory cortex. Here this area which is seen in the occipital lobe is called as the area of the visual cortex, and the visual cortex is definitely related with the frontal eye field, but area number 17 is concerned with visual functions like only vision, but the area number 8 broadband area, frontal eye field area is concerned with the movements of the eyeball, and it is confining itself to the movements of the eyeball, movements of the muscles, extraocular and intraocular muscles. Coming to the next area of speech called Broca's area number 44, 45. Broca's area is responsible for the production of expressive speech vocalization. It brings about formation of words by its connection with the adjacent primary cortex, stimulates muscles of larynx, mouth and tongue, and it's also helpful because of the movement of the soft palate and respiratory muscles. A person is able to talk because of the movement of the tongue, movements of the larynx, and by the movement of the laryngeal muscles, respiratory muscles. So this entire speech area is controlled not only not only the movements of these muscles that produces the speech, but the Broca area is also connected with this primary motor area, and it is also in coordination with the auditory area and visual area. So whenever you see something or when you hear something, you want to express about it. Say you're hearing a very nice song and you would like to express something about it, or you want to sing the song along with the audio. Once you hear it, the temporal lobe takes it to the auditory cortex, and from there you like it and you know this is your favorite song. You try to sing along with it. So singing along with it is because of the Broca's area. So there is always the coordination of the Broca's area with the primary auditory area. Similarly, it is also in association with the visual cortex. When you see something, you would like to express something. You would like to talk. So the Broca's area is an area which is in a tight coordination with the sensory cortex and motor cortex, mainly with the auditory cortex as well as the visual cortex. Coming to the lesions of Broca area, the motor speech area of the Broca result in loss of ability to produce speech, expressive aphasia, and patients think about the words. They wish to talk but they cannot. So there is no problem with the laryngeal muscles, or there is no problem with the pharyngeal muscles or the tongue or any external problem. There is only problem with expression. The problem is inability is due to the difficulty in expression and expressing the language. So this usually occurs in patients with lesions in the Broca region. Even though there is no paralysis of tongue, vocal cord paralysis, the patient can still not talk. Next, coming to the prefrontal area. The prefrontal area is the rostral to motor and premotor areas and is referred as the prefrontal area. This area is concerned with the individual personality. The prefrontal area is again seen anterior to the premotor areas, and it is responsible for the personality of a person. It exerts its influence in determining the initiative, judgment of an individual, the depths of emotions, social feelings, moral, ethical awareness, concentrations, orientation, and foresightedness. So emotions, as you know, it is the anger, the happiness, the sad feeling, the let down feeling, all that is emotions. Social is, that you are in a in which environment you are in. Maybe you are in a classroom or you are in a marketplace, you are in a theater. So you are able to recognize in which kind of a social environment you are in. So that is recognition of social environment. Moral, you know what is good, what is bad, what to do, what not to do. So that is moral. Ethical. you know what is ethics, right? What is right to do, what is not right to do. For example, you take a history of a patient, and can you ever let down the history of the patient? Can you ever share it with somebody else? No. A patient information should always be confidential, and it's the reports taken from the patient should be confidential. So that is ethical. So your brain tells you that it is not ethical to share certain things. So that is ethical awareness. Then concentrations. When you're listening to the class, your complete concentration is towards the what you are learning. So that concentration is in the prefrontal area. Orientation. This concentration will tend to make you orient to the subject what you are learning. So again, orientation is part of concentration. Then foresightedness. What is foresightedness? Expecting something to come. Foresightedness is you have a feeling that you may fall sick. You have a foresightedness, or you may think something is going to come or something is going to happen. So that kind of a foresightedness is again responsible. It is the prefrontal area of the brain is responsible for it. So sensory cortex. The sensory cortex area is area number 3 to 1, located in the postcentral gyrus, and it extends into the posterior part of the paracentral lobule on the medial surface also. The primary center for the sensory functions will be the primary sensory cortex, and it is assigned at a particular part of the body. The thumb, finger, lips, and tongue contain and they are part of the primary sensory cortex. The main function is perception of exteroceptive functions like pain, touch, and temperature. The primary sensory area receives projectional fibers from the ventroposterolateral and ventroposteromedial nucleus of the thalamus. So, this next coming to the small sensory cortex, it's located in the upper lip of the lateral sulcus. It's also called as smell, SMLL. It is otherwise called, and this area relates more to the pain perception. The ablation of this area may relieve pain. So this is usually done whenever the pain fibers are being, cut, or it is sliced off to relieve the pain of the patient. Whenever it is very extreme pain, they do relieve the pain by interrupting this sensory tracts. Area number 5 and 7, the sensory association areas, what we call as a perception of shape, size, and roughness, texture without seeing the object by touching it. Area number 5 and 7 is fully sensory area, and with the sensation of an object, you are able to identify the object even without seeing it. The right example for it is the Braille language of the blind. So they usually touch the object, and with the touching, the Braille itself is completely based on touch receptors. So based on touching the texture of this object, the size, the shape of the object, they are able to identify what object it is even without seeing it. So that perception we call it as the perception of the object. Okay, so that is by the area number 5 and 7. Next is the sensory area called Wernicke's area, which is very important. Area number 39. Wernicke's area is located in the left dominant hemisphere, occupying the posterior part of the superior temporal gyrus of the temporal lobe. It is concerned with interpretation of language through visual and auditory input. So interpretation of language through visual and auditory input is you are able to visualize something and you are able to understand. You are able to hear something and you are able to understand. So you are able to interpret the language with the vision and auditory reflex. This can be very easily explained when you are asked to watch a song which of a different language which you don't know. So with the visuals of the song and with the music and with the the with the visuals of the song, you are able to interpret what the song is about or what they are singing actually, though you don't know the language. So that is the kind of interpretation of the visual and the auditory stimuli. So it is also an essential zone for constant availability of the learned word patterns. Sensory and motor speech areas exist together in one of the hemispheres also. The Wernicke's area is connected with the Broca's area because they both of them are concerned with speech, and they are connected by a tuft of nerve fibers, what we call as the arcuate fasciculus. This is a point to be noted, can be asked in MCQ or multiple choice question, the fill in the blank questions. What is arcuate fibers? Arcuate fasciculus. Arcuate fasciculus is nothing but a bundle of fibers that connects the Wernicke's area with the Broca's area, because Wernicke's and Broca's both of them have the function of language interpretation. They are responsible for speech. The Wernicke's area is responsible for language interpretation, and the Broca's area is responsible for speech. So since they are concerned with speech, both of them are interconnected. So the lesions at the Wernicke's area can produce loss of ability to talk, understand, speak, and written speech. This condition is called receptive aphasia. Aphasia means inability to talk. And if the Broca's area is unaffected, then expressive speech is impaired. Whenever Broca's area is lost, the expressive speech is lost. But whenever Wernicke's area is lost, completely the patient will not be able to understand, speak, or write. So Wernicke's area usually has the angular and the supramarginal gyri essential for the process of learning, reading and writing, computational skills, that is your mathematical skills. Lesions in the angular and the supramarginal gyri, aphasial disorders, disabilities in reading which we call it as alexia, writing which is called as the agraphia, lack of computing efficiency that is called acalculia, lack of recognition of names of a known object that is the anomia. Lesions of Wernicke's and Broca's area result in loss of speech production as well as understanding spoken written speech global aphasia. So whenever there is a loss in the Wernicke's area, there is associated abnormalities of aphasia, elea, agraphia, acalculi, and anomia. Aphasia is difficulty in talking. Disability in reading is alexia. Agraphia is inability to write. Computing senses are lost. This is called acalculi. Recognition of the names of the objects. Even the known objects. I show you a tree and you're not able to identify it's a tree. Then it is anomia. Some basic things are lost. Okay. So loss of usually happens whenever lesions of the Wernicke's area. So this is the Broca's area which we were talking about. This is the Wernicke's area which is seen in the temporal lobe. This purplish area is the broad primary auditory cortex, and this greenish turn, which is seen near the lateral sulcus area, is the supramarginal and the angular gyrus, which is responsible for all the intelligent activities and cognitive activities. This is the supramarginal gyrus. So this is the primary motor cortical area. This brown color area is the Wernicke's area. So temporal lobe is mainly concerned with auditory cortex area number 41, 42. The superior temporal gyrus is occupying the anterior transverse and temporal gyrus, otherwise called casus gyrus. The primary auditory cortex receives inputs from medial geniculate through the auditory radiations, and medial geniculate body received inputs through the organ of corti through inferior colliculus. Remember when we studied the midbrain, so there was two colliculi what you saw in the midbrain, a pair of superior colliculus, a pair of inferior colliculus, right? And there was a sulcus called as the sulcus quadragemina which divided the four colliculus. The pair of superior colliculus is responsible for the visual impulses and the visual stimuli, while the inferior colliculus was responsible for the auditory. So the inferior colliculus will again through the inferior colliculus it goes to the medial geniculate body in the thalamus. Through that it reaches the sensory cortex. That is how the auditory stimulus reaches the sensory cortex, and visual it is through the superior colliculus. Through the lateral geniculate nucleus of thalamus it reaches the primary sensory cortex. So that is how the auditory cortex is related with the sensory cortex. And secondary auditory area, the lateral surface of the superior temporal gyrus, slightly posterior to the auditory cortex, is called secondary auditory area. It receives auditory impulses from the auditory cortex and correlates it with the auditory experiences. So last is the functional area of the occipital lobe, that is area number 17. Primary visual area, which is marked for the visual stimuli. White stria, otherwise called as visual stria of Gennari, and it's called as visual stria because it is responsible for the vision. It is made up of thin, huge amounts of granule cells. Visual cortex receives afferent fibers from lateral geniculate body and optic radiations. As I said, visual fibers always travel through superior colliculus. Through the superior colliculus, through the lateral geniculate body in the thalamus, it reaches through the optic radiations, it reaches the sensory cortex and the visual cortex. So visual cortex is seen in the occipital lobe. The visual cortex receives afferent fibers from the temporal half of the ipsilateral retina and the nasal half of the contralateral retina. So the right half of the vision is always controlled by the left half of the brain. And the macular area is the central area of the retina responsible for maximum visual acuity, that is called as the keenest vision. So the lesions with this visionary area or area number 17 is inferior quadrantic hemianopia, superior quadrantic hemianopia. Secondary visual area, otherwise called Brodmann's area number 18-19, receives afferent fibers from visual area, thus enabling individuals to recognize and appreciate what he is seeing. So the visual area is always enabled and it is connected with the temporal area for the memory. It is connected with the auditory area for vision with coordination with the auditory impulses. It is connected with the sensory cortex, it is connected with the motor cortex, it is connected with the Broca's area, it is connected with the Wernicke's area. So vision is connected and associated with all the other regions of the brain, so that by seeing you are able to talk, by seeing you are able to hear, by seeing an object and hearing an object you are able to coordinate, and you are able to conclude or talk, right? All these activities are coordinated and they are all programmed, right? Properly programmed. That's why you are able to see and immediately do simultaneous actions in a coordinated way. Coming to the taste, postcentral gyrus has taste sensation, vestibular area for the sensations around face, olfactory area in the anterior to parahippocampal gyrus for the olfaction. So the interpeduncular fossa is nothing but a fossa that is seen at the base of the brain, and it is a rhomboidal space between the bounded on the either sides by crus cerebri of the cerebral peduncles. Anteriorly you have optic chiasma and the optic tracts, posteriorly the pons. Now the contents of this area will be two elevations called mammillary bodies. They are nothing but grey matter, and between the mammillary bodies there is also something called tuber cinereum. There is stalk of pituitary seen in this fossa, and along with the pituitary stalk you have infundibulum and the posterior perforated substance, which is nothing but again matter, grey matter, along with the posterior cerebral vessels to be located in the interpeduncular fossa. It is located between the two cerebral peduncles, what we call as crus cerebri. And since it is a rhomboid shaped fossa, and the main contents are the oculomotor nerve, which takes its origin from there, and you also have the presence of circular ovulis, okay, which is the main blood supply for the brain. So this is the location of the interpeduncular fossa. See the interpeduncular fossa, this is the optic radiation anteriorly, pons posteriorly. On either sides you get the parahippocampal gyrus, the presence of the two mammillary body, tuber cinereum. The oculomotor nerve is taking its origin from there. This is the oculomotor nerve, and here you also have the posterior perforated substance, which is nothing masses of grey matter along with the posterior cerebral vessels. So this is the enlarged image wherein this is the optic tract and the optic radiation. This is the stalk of infundibular pituitary gland, and this is the tuber cinereum. This is the mammillary body. This is the posterior perforated substance. This is the oculomotor nerve taking its origin. So when this is oculomotor, obviously this is the trochlea. But the trochlea is taking origin on the dorsal aspect, so I have not mentioned much about it. And this is the cerebral peduncles, which is forming the borders for the interpeduncular fossa. I hope the lecture was useful. So if you repeatedly try to see the lecture, maybe it is easy for you to understand and learn. If you have any questions, you can always post it as a comment, and your feedback on the lecture can also be posted as a comment. Thank you so much.